Thank you so much. My name is Paulo Somaini. I'm at Stanford GSB. And the purpose of this lecture is to give you an introduction to empirical market design. And in particular, I'm going to pay a lot of attention to school choice. And then later today, you're going to see, and tomorrow, you're going to see more applications of empirical market designs that are not school choice. Okay. So let's start with the typical competitive market framework that we are so familiar with. We assume that if individuals are, if we assume that individuals are price-taking, have price-taking behavior, that is, they're not setting prices, that goods are homogeneous, and that there is perfect information, and we invoke the existence of a Walrasian auctioneer, then we get that there are going to be some prices that are going to clear the market, and we're going to have the first and second welfare theorems, right? So that's a sort of thing that you learn in your first course in micro in European. However, a lot of interesting things happen when this condition fails. And we see that in the real world, some of these conditions are going to fail in most of the markets that we're going to analyze. And the study of these market failures is central in many fields in economics. So for example, in IO, we think about monopoly, we think about collusion. In contract theory, people think about principal agent problems with hidden types or hidden actions. In labor, people worry about monopsony, big firms having monopsony power over their the employees, essentially. And in macro, there is price rigidity, agency problems. And in market design, we're going to be thinking about things like a congestion, price discovery in auctions, market design, and the allocation mechanism. So what is it that we're doing in market design? We're really asking the question of how do markets really work? And we're going to forget a little bit about the Walrasian auctioneer, and we're going to try to get deep down and try to take the market institutions very seriously, okay? We're going to think about, okay, maybe there is some frictions in trade, maybe there's some congestion, maybe there are coordination failures, that people don't find the product that they want right away. And there also may be market failures in the same way that in IO, there might be collusion, there may be market power, there may be imperfect information. But what is going to be important is that we're going to be thinking about, okay, what are the rules that this market operates under? Are there laws that regulate it? What are the political or institutional constraints that individuals have to abide by? Okay, and once we understand those rules, when we understand those institutions, we're going to ask, okay, what are the participants' incentives? One, we have those rules. And we're going to be thinking about, okay, given those incentives, what is the mechanism that clears the market? Okay. So yesterday in Harrison Jones' lecture, you thought auction, you saw auctions, and in that case, we're trying to discover a price at which the good is going to sell or the procurement is going to get contracted, right? Today you talk about priority cutoffs. So there are going to be these priority cutoffs that are going to see what priority each student needs, say, to get into a particular school. Okay, tomorrow Dan is going to be talking about waitlist, and in that case, the object that clears the market is wait time. Okay, as long as if you wait more, if something is very desirable, well, you need to wait more for it. Okay, so these are all the different ways in which markets are going to clear, and we're going to try to understand exactly how what is the clearing mechanism in each of these markets. Okay, so what do we want? Okay, we want to go back to have a first welfare theorem. Many times we're not going to be able to have it, but we want to have efficiency. Okay, we want to get to the Pareto optimal allocation, and we don't have a first welfare theorem, so we'll have to work. We're going to be thinking, okay, how do we get to an efficient allocation? We're also going to care about fairness and distributional constraints. Okay. Now we don't have a second welfare theorem anymore, so we're not going to be able to basically say, okay, well, if you redistribute the initial endowment, you can get any point in the Pareto frontier, so and we go home. We don't have this type of redistributions, so we're going to have to think, okay, if you change this rule, if you change your rule, what's going to happen in terms of distribution, in terms of fairness? And we're also going to be sometimes constrained by some notions of fairness, either in the procedure. That is that, okay, people that are equal need to be treated equal, what people call procedural fairness, or we need to be thinking about a fairness in the location, that we want a particular number of seats in a school to go a particular type of students, for example. Okay. And another concern that we're going to have when we think about mechanism market design is how practical is our proposed mechanism or our proposed set of institutions. There is an ideal out there of strategy proofness. Ideally, you want to tell your participants, oh, look, you don't have to strategize. You just have to tell us the truth, and the mechanism solves it in a very, very fancy but easy way. But at the same time, you need the rules to define the rules that are easy to explain and to qualify. And sometimes these two conflicts may be in conflict. Okay, so you saw with the fair acceptance is strategy proof. It's correct to tell people you shouldn't strategize, you should tell us the truth. But if you explain the rules to them, maybe they may get a little bit confused. Okay, so those are the things that we're going to be thinking about. Okay, so what are the tools that we're going to use? Well, of course, there is a lot of theory that comes into place. There is a lot of game theory, a lot of computer science, notions that we're going to use. In particular, we're going to be thinking about what is the relevant equilibrium notion for this particular case, what is relevant stability notion. And also we're going to be thinking about strategy proofness. And ideally, what we are going to be doing is essentially trying to say, okay, can we get to efficiency? But if we do that, are there any distribution constraints that we need to satisfy? Okay, so those are going to be all theoretical tools. But what I'm going to talk about today is mainly about empirical analysis. And in that case, we're going to use a lot of statistics and econometrics, and what you learned in the first few lectures of this summer school are going to become very handy. Okay. And why are we going to do empirical work? Well, because we want to test hypotheses. We want to basically figure out where the theoretical predictions are borne out in the data. We want to also estimate economic primitives and use those estimates to evaluate alternative designs. Okay, and down the road, what we want our results to do is to inform policy, and in that case, you need to be able to explain that to people involved in the particular market that you're studying. So sometimes that is another skill that you are going to have to learn along the way. Okay, so how do I think about empirical market design? Well, it's a complementary to theory because mainly theory is going to tell us some predictions that about equilibrium, and we can go out and verify those predictions, test those hypotheses. Theory is going to tell us that there are some trade-offs. Maybe if you do this, some people are going to win, some people are going to lose. But we are going to be able to empirically quantify those trade-offs. And we are going to also, sometimes theory won't tell us an ambiguous prediction, that because the prediction is going to, because what's going to happen with a particular change is going to depend on technology, preferences. Well, we can try to estimate those preferences. So that's where we're going. Okay. The other nice thing about empirical market design is that we're going to be studying markets that are particularly organized. I don't want to say necessarily well organized, but this is an institution, this is a market, and typically those type of, when you have a mechanism like that, the mechanism is going to generate some data, some administrative data that may be very useful for empirical work, and that's what we're going to try to exploit, in particular in school choice. Okay, so and the empirical approaches that we're going to develop here are also going to be useful in other areas of economics. For example, when we estimate preferences for schools, well, we're going to be contributing and using tools for estimation of demand in other contexts as well. And when we think about a particular policy intervention in, say, in school choice, well, that also has implications for economics of education, for example, obviously. Okay, any questions before I jump into school choice? Okay, so now let me narrow down to the problem of school choice. Why do we care about school choice? Well, we typically think that education is a key instrument to achieve both economic progress and also social mobility, right? Many countries in the world, in particular in the West, have very large public school systems that have a particular aim to basically reach every single child, or every single, particularly in elementary school, right? And why is that? Well, because there is an ideal of equal opportunity. If we give equal opportunity to, if we basically give the same opportunities to every child, what's going to happen is that, well, one is that's the society that you want to live in. Before you are thrown into this world, you like to live in a society where, you know, but you have a high chance of having opportunities, but also in terms of efficiency, right? You don't know when the next Albert Einstein, who the next Albert Einstein would be, and you want to educate everyone so that you have more draws from the distribution, essentially, right? But we know that we live in a world where there are a lot of economic inequities, and those are going to invariably tilt the playing field. Okay, so richer parents are going to try to send their kids to better schools are going to have better teachers, and you know the ideal of equal opportunity is going to be somewhat hard to achieve. Okay, so for the reason, many school districts try to essentially talk to academics and ask, okay, how can we design a system that basically maintains certain level of equal access? Okay, and that's a great opportunity for empirical researchers, because we're going to be able to apply the market design toolkit. Essentially, we're going to use theory to evaluate the properties of the mechanisms that we use for student allocation. So you talked about DA, you talked about top trading cycles, you talked about the Boston mechanism. Those are all things that we can study those mechanisms theoretically. And we can do empirical analysis. We can try to use the data generated by those mechanisms to try to come and estimate preferences, and then use those preferences that we estimated to evaluate what would be the effect of alternative designs. Okay. And then hopefully communicate our results back to the policymakers so that they make informed decisions. Okay, that's the goal. Good. Now, let me narrow it down more. Of these three things, I'm going to be talking about the second bullet point, the empirical analysis. Okay, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time in this morning lecture and in the one in the afternoon. Okay, so as we talked already, school districts rely on algorithms to allocate students to each of the schools in the district, and the algorithms are going to use student reports, and schools are going to have priorities, and together the reports and the priorities are going to determine an allocation. Right. So you saw here, I see Boston mechanism. I have it there. I also call it immediate acceptance mechanism. You see the free acceptance that Irene was talking about, subtraining cycles, there's serial dictators. There are a bunch of mechanisms that we can think about. And these mechanisms are all going to have different properties. Okay, so can anybody tell me about a mechanism and a property that you learned in the last few days or even before? So let's think about the serial dictator. Have you talked about the serial dictator mechanism? No? Okay, DA. What properties does DA have? If you see an allocation in DA, you know that the allocation satisfies what property? Yes? Stable, exactly. Stable, so as we talked this morning, there are no blocking pairs. I mean, we need to talk about how you define a blocking pair, but good. Okay, so what other property if free acceptance has? It's not necessarily? It's not necessarily very efficient. Okay, so that says that there may be a way to improve every student's welfare, or at least one student welfare without hurting anybody else.
This is why we have the efficiency adjusted DA.
Right, exactly. Good.
Yeah, so the preferences in the applications, because the mechanism is strategy proof, we can like leave the preferences data.
Exactly. So the another property is that DA is strategy proof. I mean, students would not benefit from strategizing. Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we're going to use these properties, the property stability, the strategy proofness, to try to basically say, okay, these properties imply something about how people should behave in these mechanisms, or what properties allocation should satisfy, and we're going to use those properties to derive real preference relations between schools, and with that we're going to try to we're going to exploit those. And so I'm going to talk about three cases. The first one is when we have data on allocations. So who got where? That's the only data that we have. And we're going to basically exploit the property of stability. Another one is when we have data on reports. So we actually see the rank order list of every student. And we're going to basically use the fact that these reports are generated in a strategy proof mechanism to say, okay, if they told us this, it has to be that this is the truth. And then we're going to look at mechanisms that are not strategy proof. Okay. And we're going to see how you need to use reports plus a different assumption of behavior that could be optimality of behavior given the information that individuals have to basically, again, derive reveal preferences relationship that we can use for empirical purposes. Okay, so that's where we're going. Any questions? Yes.
So just so I can understand it, and you're relying on that they have done this algorithm correctly when assigning schools?
Oh yeah, so something that you always do when you get this data, say, okay, this is how I understand that the mechanism works. So you basically try to see if it matches, and sometimes you learn new things by doing that. But yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly. That's another nice thing. Or that you can actually verify if they actually use the algorithm as they were supposed to, and you learn a lot about institutions by sometimes saying, oh, how is it that this doesn't match what I thought it would match? Yeah, that's a lot of fun always. Yes, good. So going back to what you learned from Irene, we have. Supposedly we want to estimate demand for schools, for say the most prestigious schools, where, well, we're not going to have a demand that depends on prices, like it's typical in like if I were to do demand for cars, or demand for hospitals, or demand for banks. Okay, there are no prices that are going to clear the market. Here, I'm talking about P as a price in this case. So what we're going to do is to basically try to figure out how to learn from data from these mechanisms, and what we're going to really try to think about is find tractable statistical or econometric tools. Okay, because as you're going to say, things are going to become a little bit complex, so we need to keep to estimate these models fairly. So we're going to be looking for ways that make it easier, or at least possible, to estimate these models. Okay. So let me set up a general model that I'm going to use throughout these two lectures. I'm going to be indexing students by I and school programs by J. And I'm going to say that the indirect utility of student I for school J is given by a function V that depends on three things. Some xij's that are school and individual specific characteristics. So this could be something like, does this student have a sibling in this particular school? Okay. It can also be that the J component is not important. It can be, is this student a Spanish speaker? Okay. It could be, is this school, does this school have a math program, say? Okay. Or like a Russian system math program, something like that. Okay, so it can be student or school characteristics. Sometimes we're going to have a school quality that is an observed to the econometrician, but observed to the students. that we're going to call Xij, and this should, if you took IO, that's why I chose the Xij is an unobserved quality component that is school specific. Then some shock that we don't observe, that is IID, is a preference shock of student I for school J, and then we're going to have a numeraire, and I'm going to call dij. In school choice, we have used distance, the distance of school I to the residence of student I, school J to the residence of student I, as one metric of utility. You can also think that this is tuition, and I'm going to talk about a paper today that thinks of dij as tuition, but what is important is that this is a numeraire. This is going to basically set the units of the utility, right, of the indirect utility. Okay, so one simple case is a simple linear model where we have dij is just a linear function of xij and has a parameter beta that we are interested in estimating. More complicated models have random coefficients. Now each individual I has basically a gamma I. And gamma I is a random coefficient that is going to basically affect each individual utility for each of the characteristics. So this could be, there are some students that like, say, schools that are good in math, for example, and therefore if those students are going to rank all the schools that are good at math above all the schools, most of the schools that are not good at math, something like that. Okay, so this is a way to say, well, there is some type of individual heterogeneity that is not fully captured by the IID shock epsilon ij. Another way to say this is that we are basically allowing for some correlation between the idiosyncratic shocks between different schools, right? Because if I assume that epsilon ij is IID across schools, then essentially once I know the x's, two individuals should be the same. Well, by allowing gamma I that to basically have an individual heterogeneity that affects student characteristics, I'm saying, well, maybe there is some correlation in the parts that are not observed about the individuals. Okay. Any questions about these parameterizations? Yes.
It probably be first relevant a little later, but how many like usually in school applications you'll have maybe they'll only apply for one school, and we're also including a random coefficient here.
Right.
Is there certain identification considered?
Yeah, we're going to be thinking about a little bit. Yeah, we can talk about identification more, but yeah, you're right. If people submit only one choice, it's going to be very hard to identify a model that is this complex. If people submit many choices, as you see, oh look, two individuals that are observationally equivalent have very different ranking behavior. One ranks very high all schools that have these characteristics. The other one ranks very highly schools that have these other characteristics. So this correlation in the ranks that are in the school's rank that are not explained by observables can be attributed to a random coefficient like that. That's exactly right. Yes.
So the assumption that school quality is equally observed by all students. Can this model account for the fact that some students might be more informed than other students about school quality?
Oh, okay, good. So right now I'm not getting into learning about about school characteristics. There will be another layer of the model, and there are papers that are doing that. I can refer you to some references, but yeah, I'm not getting into that right now. And that actually one of the things that I'm going to point out as exciting avenues for research, and I can point to some people that are trying to think in that direction. Great question. Yes. Good. Okay, so let's do this. Let's try first to think, okay, what's new about this model? This model that I described here. This is a model that I could have written down to estimate the demand for again, cars, demand for hospitals, demand for banks, demand for anything that you think that a student chooses one of like a discrete choice. It's just one of many options, right? And actually, yeah, this model is inspired in those models. You know, the discrete choice model, D is just price, right? It's your indirect utility depends negatively on the price that you pay for the product. And each consumer is just going to choose a good that gives them the maximum utility, right? Maximum indirect utility. The numerator is price, and there are many ways that we can estimate these models, and we learned how to do that in the past. Okay, so the key thing to understand of those in that case is that now I'm going to map again. I'm going to use pictures, but I'm going to use different pictures than what Irene was showing you. Irene was showing you a space of priority, right? You have priority for school 1, priority for school 2. Your point in that map, in that graph, meant that you had a particular priority for one school, a particular priority for another school. Here I'm going to change that. I'm going to keep priority fixed, and I'm going to here there's no priority, but I'm going to basically think about indirect utilities in the graphs, in the axis. Okay, so basically, if your indirect utility is negative for both products, you just don't buy any of the two products. So in this negative orthant, you're going to basically stay away by the outside good. If you value product 1 more than the outside option, and you're below the 45-degree line up there, meaning that you value good 1 more than good 2, you're going to pick good 1, and otherwise you pick good 2. That's easy. That's the standard graph that I want you to get familiar, because we're going to use over and over. But this is a standard thing that you get in discrete choice. And we know how to estimate this model. There are many ways. So if you come from IO, that you have a method of moments by BLP, Barry, Levinson, and Pakes. If you come from marketing, you're going to basically have seen Bayesian methods using Markov Monte Carlo chains. Also, you can do it by maximum score, where you try to actually have the parameters that maximize the number of times that you predict that a consumer is going to choose a particular product. You can think about moment inequalities. And today, I'm going to pay particular attention to maximum likelihood, just because it helps me organize the discussion a bit better. If you want to estimate this by maximum likelihood, and you assume that the epsilon shock divided by some constant sigma is distributed extreme value type 1, then you're going to have the logic specification, essentially. Now let me define all this term equal to delta ij. We can write down the likelihood or the probability that I chooses j as essentially x of 1 over sigma times delta ij minus the price for good j faced by individual I. Okay, so this has a very nice close form solution, and this can be the likelihood for this particular, if we observe I chooses j. Okay, so this gives us a very tractable way to estimate discrete choice models, and this is why logic models are so popular in discrete choice models. Okay, and we're going to see that sometimes the school choice are also going to be very convenient. But the key thing is that it has this particular formulation because the review preference arguments have this shape. That basically each individual chooses the good and maximizes their own indirect utility. Okay, good. So basically, what is special about school choice? Well, it is that students cannot just pick the school that they prefer the most. Typically, schools are not going to have prices; they're going to have priorities, and there's going to be an algorithm that I'm going to define as capital Phi, that is going to take individual reports R, like aggregate over all the reports of all the students, a set of priorities T, and a set of random lotteries that I'm going to call here nu, that are going to determine the location. Okay, so that's what's going to be different. That individuals are not going to should be choosing just school that maximizes the indirect utility. Okay, and here's some notation. I use capital letters to denote basically a collection of vectors. So R is a collection of vectors. Each vector Ri is a vector that tells basically the report of each student that is, okay, I rank school 1, school A first, school B second, school C third. Ti is going to be, again, a vector that tells you what is the priority that each individual has in each of the schools. Okay. And the tiebreaker is going to be nuij. And as Irene was pointed out, there's multiple tiebreakers in which there's nuij IID uniform 0, 1, or single tiebreaker in which muij is really mu I, right? You have only one mu per student. Okay. Good. Okay, so we talked about different acceptance, but let me just reiterate it. Maybe this is going to be too easy or known to you, but one way to characterize the proposed different acceptance is that first student apply to the first school in the list. So student report the rank order list, and the mechanism is going to behave as if students go apply to the first school in the list. Then the school consider all the applicants that ranked that school, and provisionally calls applicants according to the priority and until they exhaust the capacity and rejects the remaining students. Okay, the key word here is provisionally, or because it's going to be the fair acceptance, right? Then students get their say, okay, if a student was rejected, then it basically applies to the next highest school in their list, and then schools again take the new applications with the ones that it had previously stored and ranks all the students again and until the student capacity and rejects some of the students that fall below the capacity limit. Okay, so a student that was basically accepted, that was not rejected in step 1 can be rejected later on. And then we repeat steps 3 and 4 until basically each student is every single student is each student is either tentatively held by a school or has been rejected by all the schools that they rank. Okay, so that's one way to think about different acceptance. And for the purpose of what we're going to be talking today, I want you to remember the word provisionally. That is the key thing that is going to matter when I compare it with immediate acceptance. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to think about the properties of DA. Okay, so going back to what Irene was saying, okay, DA has a report-specific cutoff representation. Okay, so in particular, the score that we're going to think that the score of a particular student for a particular school is a function that depends on the report, the priority, and the tiebreaker. That's general. That's a general form. And there's going to be a cutoff. And again, this is what Irene called the budget set. Each student is going to be placed in the highest ranked school in the set of schools for which the score of student I clears the cutoff. Okay. Now, one key thing is that in DA, this function f doesn't depend on R. Okay. So you cannot change your priority score by changing your report. That is one way to think about what DA is doing in the context in this context. Okay, so that means that DA is going to have two of the properties that you already mentioned: strategy proofness. Agents are not going to have incentives to misreport their preferences. In fact, they're going to have incentives to report ordinal preferences truthfully, and we're going to have a stable allocation. That is that each student is going to be allocated to the school that they prefer among the sets that among the schools that are in what Irene called the budget set. Essentially, they call it S here. She was inordinate by B. Okay. And one of the reasons we like, as we said, is because basically you don't need to strategize. That means that if you think that, I don't know, rich parents are better at strategizing than poor parents, you are basically not giving some rich parents or sophisticated parents an unfair advantage. Okay, so now suppose that you have DA, and suppose that you only have data on the location. So you don't see who reported what, you just see who went where. That's everything you see. Okay, so how do you proceed based on that? Okay, so let's try to derive some preference relationships. Suppose that one thing that you can say is you can say, okay, you can compute the score of each individual for each school. Okay, so you can compute E, and you can see, you're going to be able to see what was the market clearing cutoff for each of the schools. So even if you don't see the whole report of preferences, you're going to be able to calculate what schools were in each student's budget set, because you can compute the score of each individual for each school, and you know the cutoff, because you will know what is the lowest priority score of someone that was actually admitted to this particular school. Okay, so good. With that, you can say, okay, suppose that we have a case with two schools. If you see a student that had the full choice set, you basically are back in the consumer discrete choice model. You basically see, okay, this guy had everything in the choice set. This person basically chose the school that maximized their indirect utility. Okay, that's easy. That's easy. The nice thing is that, well, maybe you're going to, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
You said you know the lowest student's score. Do we read it from data, or do we recalculate the deferred acceptance?
Well, remember, if we only have data on the location, we cannot recalculate the A because we don't know what the reports were. But we can see, okay, I know what is the I can basically compute the score, the EIJ of every individual that was actually placed.
I mean PJ.
Sorry? Yeah. I'm telling you how to get PJ. I can compute EIJ for each I that we observe in J, that was allocated to J. Okay. Then I can basically say, okay, what is the minimum value of epsilon ij of EIJ of someone that was allocated that ended up in good J, and that is a pretty good approximation for PJ. So
you know the EIJ from the lottery?
You know the AIJ because you know, yes, you know exactly, you know, well, that's a good point. So suppose that, yeah, you need to know the lotteries. And here we are going to see that the implementation of this, typically we have that this is going to be an exam score that we're going to observe. Yeah, good point. Good point.
If it's lottery and you don't observe it,
yeah,
data didn't arrive to you, so you can just recalculate the A for.
Well, you cannot recalculate the A because you don't have the reports.
But you, for example, from the district you get the reports.
Say that again?
From the district you get data of reports.
Yes. Oh well, yeah. That's going to be the next case. So for the moment, I'm thinking, yes. Suppose if you have data reports data, then I agree with you. Yes, but I'm going to talk about that later. Yes.
Also, you need to assume that schools are like at full capacity or something like that, right? Like the capacity is timed in some way.
Well, if you see that basically the score, the priority score, minimum priority score is essentially 0, you know that the school may not be at capacity because it admitted someone that had a really low priority score. So think about that. You see who goes where, but you also see the score of that each student would have had in every possible school. Okay, so you can compute what is the lowest priority that was admitted to a particular school, and that is going to be your best guess for the cutoff, essentially. And yeah, if the that priority is very low, you are okay. Is this really, was this school capacity or not? Well, but you need to take a stance. And but yeah, in principle, you would tell that this is a school that had such a low priority score, has a student with such a low priority score that makes me think that this school is not constrained. Okay, so what happens if we see a particular student that had only one school in the choice set? Well, in that case, suppose that this student only had school one in the choice set. In that case, what we only can learn is that if the student was assigned to the outside option, is that this student preferred the outside option to school one. And if the student was allocated to school one, we can only infer that this student prefers school one to be outside. We can make no inference about school two because this agent didn't have school two in the choice set. Okay, so because it looks so similar, this looks so similar to the consumer choice setting, we can basically see how it looks like with logit error shock. And we're going to see that in fact, it turns out that it works. The only thing that we need to be careful with is that now we need to basically only include in the denominator schools that are in the budget set, schools that are attainable by this student. Okay, so the only thing that we know is that if we see student I assigned to J, is that student I prefers J to every other school in the budget set. Okay. Before it was every single school, now it's only schools in the budget. If we have random coefficients, we can also, that's fine. We can basically say, okay, remember gamma was a random coefficient. Now we're going to have this delta Hij is going to depend on gamma, and we need to integrate gamma over some distribution of random coefficients. That's more complicated, but we know how to do that. So that's fine. But still, just focus on the simple logit one. We have a closed form solution for the likelihood. So in principle, we can estimate it using logits. One thing that is important here that you mentioned is that in order to construct this S, we need to observe the lotteries, as you mentioned, because we need to understand who was allocated basically the cutoff for each school. And sometimes, as I was saying, that basically results of an exam. Now, the interesting thing that I want you to think about is that many times what we need to assume here is that essentially the preferences are not correlated with the budget set. And that assumption may or may not be something that you want to do in a particular context. Suppose that the budget set is determined by an exam score, then you need to really say, okay, do I want to think that individuals that test very well have the same preferences or have the same distribution of preferences as those that don't test as well. Okay, and that is, you know, that is a discussion that you can have, and you can think about ways to solve that. But I'm not going to go deep into that right now. But that is a concern once you're doing this. I want to be upfront with that. Okay, so there are two papers that apply this method. One is Akiola and Krishna 2017. There are more. Another one is Alonso Bucaray 2008 for collages in Chile. I'm going to talk about this one a little bit just to give you an idea of the things that people did.
The book,
Yeah.
Franklin and Hay.
Franklin and Hay. But they want, because they say yes with DA. You see the reports. Okay, yeah, I'm going to talk about that later. Right, it's a little bit different, but given that it came up here, so there is another paper that is going to say even if you have data reports, even if you have data reports, for some reason that I'm going to explain later, you may want to rely only on stability. Okay, and that's Fregren and they show why you might want to rely on stability, even if you have data reports. Yeah, thanks. No, that's perfect. Okay, so this is an interesting setting. In 2014, the Chilean government promised to make college free to students. That's great. But the key thing is that before that, low-income students already received some type of financial aid. Okay. So that meant that if you were a low-income student in Chile, and you wanted to study in a prestigious university, you would pay a lower tuition than a rich student from a rich family. So one hypothesis is that, yeah, this may look great, but if college is free for all students, now high-income students will face exactly the same price as low-income students, which is 0. And maybe the high-income students test better, and they are going to therefore get better priority for good colleges, good programs. And that means that in effect, they're going to end up displacing low-income students. Okay. So maybe, we don't know. I mean, that depends on whether high-income students prefer the same schools as low-income students, so that they're going to displace it, and if they basically are sensitive to prices, essentially to tuition. Okay, so what Alonso did in this paper is to take data on the student enrollment, data and in this case they have a national test that in several categories, that each school weights different components of the test differently. But the system runs DA, so we can assume that basically allocation is stable. And they're going to use this approach to, Alonso is going to use this approach to estimate preferences for colleges. And then we can simulate counterfactually what would happen if every single school charged a tuition of 0. That's what happens. And then ask the question that the title of his paper is talking about: who pays for free college? That is, who ends up bearing the cost of having free college for all. Okay, so let me quickly go over this. So this is the table where basically all the results come together. So let's think about this, the panel B, where he has some random coefficient, some gamma on the price coefficient, so that some individuals are more sensitive to price than others. And what you can see here is the overall utility, the change in overall utility from going from positive tuition to 0 tuition. And what you see is that the poorest individuals lose in terms of utility, and the rich individuals win in terms of utility. So you say gain. So you say, how come? Okay, one thing that I want you to see is this sticker tuition, that is basically, suppose that you say, okay, this was the tuition that they paid before, and think of that as a measure of, that is the sticker tuition. So I think of that as a characteristic of the school. Well, what this is saying is that, look, now the richer individuals are going to schools that used to charge a higher price. Okay, so these are, on average, if you're in the richest quintile, you're going to a school, okay, that charges 1,200 pesos, 1,200 pesos more than the school that you were being allocated when you had to pay for tuition. Okay, so this is saying that richer people are going to better schools at the end of the day, and they're not paying money, so that's a win for them, right? On the other hand, for poor people, well, they end up going to worse schools, but they also receive a positive scholarship, meaning that, okay, they're paying less than before. But the key thing is that there is a massive, the key thing goes here, and that's why these numbers are negative, is that the overall efficiency of the allocation went down. that if you take the utility net of price, everybody's, or not everybody, like for every quantum, the average is negative. And this is that prices were actually assigning colleges to people that like them the most. Once you remove prices, then that efficiency force gets eliminated, and now intensity of preferences are not taken into account in the location anymore, because it's DA. You just report your ordinal ranking. If you prefer one school a lot more, if you have a very strong preference for one school, there's no way you can express that in the system. When there was price, well, the prices could play a role of basically signaling that one school is very high quality. Okay, and the interesting thing is that actually, the better way to cut this is not so much by income, but also by test scores. If you were testing very well, this policy really helps you, because you can get to any school anyways, but now you don't have to pay. Okay, so this is one example of a paper that exploits this idea of identifying preferences and the type of things that you can do once you have preferences. You can evaluate different outcomes. Okay, I think this is a good time for me to give you a break to. So I have until 12:15, right? Yeah. So I think it's a 5-minute break. It's a good point for a 5-minute break, so we can, and then we can come back in 5 minutes, and I can continue with the lunch. And I'm here if you want to ask questions. Feel free to ask. Yes. Yeah. So you basically, so there is this paper that I've seen. So what they do is they have another model of information acquisition, and basically your utility then depends on the things that you know, the things that you expect on average, and then you have another model that tells you another system of equations that tells you which are specifically going to use. So it gets, it's another layer you put on top of this. So it's not changing, it's another layer. Because I don't know. Because I don't know what is your pattern. Yes. No, keep going, yeah. Well, that's the thing. What we did right now, we didn't observe reports. We just saw the location. Alonso didn't see the reports. Now I'm going to talk about what happens if you observe reports. Yeah. No. I understood that. So stability. This is only to see. You explore the stability. You only see the final location. You don't see the. Right. Exactly. That's what I'm going to do next. What is coming next? Exactly. Yes, you're right. You're right. That's what's coming next. That's right. Yes. Yeah. You need to basically, when you do that, right, if you want to talk about homogeneity, you will basically have to have an instrument that moves the choices. Nikhil and I have a paper on that. And I mean, it opens, yeah. I need to have an instrument that basically changes the budget without changing the preferences. And then you can do it. We are working, we have a paper now on essentially, again, it's dialysis. So we see what patient, each patient is getting the dialysis. And also, it's not the full acceptance, but we think it's a stable, we impose stability. And then we have something that shifts the probability that a facility will find a particular patient that needs it. So, and things work, but it's not complicated. But we also estimate the maximum similarity.
We're trying to do that.
Yeah, no. My goal is to do truthful reports now and then lunch. My plan was to stop before stability, but then I forgot and I kept going.
And none of it's very.
All right. Okay. So now let me make something clear. What I talked about just now is, okay, what happens if you only see the allocation? You know that the mechanism was the A, or was any mechanism that gave you a stable allocation? You assume stability and you go on using that. But as some of you correctly mentioned, you can do more if you see the reports that were submitted to the mechanism in a DA context. Okay, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. Now suppose that you do see what people report to the mechanism. Okay, now it's much more important because now it's interesting because now you have more information, right? It's strictly more information because you see not only where they ended up, but what were their first choices or second choices or third choices and so forth. So think about a case where there are two schools as usual, so I can plot it in a figure like this. Now it's no longer the case that I can't distinguish between this part of the utility space and that part of the utility space. Now I can distinguish between the two. In both cases, this individual, if it's admissible to school 1, is going to get to school 1. Okay, but in this case, if the utility of this individual is for school 1 is positive, but the utility for school 2 is negative, this individual is going to only rank school 1. Over there, if the utility for school 1 is greater than the utility for school 2, which is greater than 0, the individual is going to rank first school 1 and then school 2. The opposite happens in this area. If the utility for V2 is greater than the utility for school 1, which is greater than 0, this individual is going to rank 2 and then 1. And if the utility for school 2 is positive and the utility for school 1 is negative, then the individual is going to rank school 2. So we can partition the utility space in more sets. Yes?
There's a question online. In this case, we consider preferences in the utility sense over college only. Is it possible to incorporate future outcomes into the consideration here? What I have in mind is that the outside option is different for different students and they have different payoffs. For example, future income associated with getting assigned to the outside option. How do we do that? Right.
Okay, good. So there are two questions here. There are two questions that one is, how do we think about the outside option? Can I assume that the outside option is the same for every individual? Okay, so the answer to that question is, this is, we're talking about utilities. Remember, you can always make some normalizations in utility, okay? So one way to say is, okay, we are always going to compare utilities versus remaining unassigned. So somebody that has a very good outside option really has low utility for all inside options, okay? Can we think about heterogeneity? Well, part of that is going to be why we have random coefficients sometimes, because we want to think about some students being fundamentally different than others and introducing some correlation between the utilities for different schools. In particular, if we think that some students may have very good outside options, that is like saying that there is a random coefficient that goes into every single inside option that is kind of negative for this student, because this student doesn't gain much from attending to any of the inside schools. Okay, and then the other question is, can we think about putting outcome measures in the utility? And the answer is yes, but then it opens up. So the answer is yes. If you think, okay, each program has associated a particular income, then you can put that income, each college has associated a particular future salary. You can basically put that salary into the utility function. So this is just a program characteristic. The most interesting thing happens when you think that individuals may have different incomes in different schools that are different programs that are different across individuals, so that individuals may be self-sorting in schools that are better for them, that give them a higher future income. That's super interesting, and there's some work based on that, and Nikhil and Parag are going to talk about that tomorrow. So great questions. And there is a very nice market paper, Sebastian Otero, also, that deals with the case, with the first case that I was thinking about. Okay, so yes, those are very interesting avenues for research, and new things are being done in that sense. Yeah. Oh yeah, that was an online question, so I was trying to look at the person who asked, but yeah. Good. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so suppose that we move to estimating this using a logic model. Well, it turns out that the logic formulation also works great. Works great because now we can basically use all the information on all the rank order list. Essentially, we're going to say, okay, now the probability that I submits a rank order list Ri is equal to the product of several components. The first component is that, say, I'm going to say it verbally and then I'm going to explain the math. The first component is, okay, school one, the school that you rank in the first position, is preferred to all the other schools. The second component, the second factor in this multiplication is the school that you rank in second position is preferred to all schools, except for the one that you rank first. Same thing. Third factor is that the school that you rank third is preferred to all schools except for the first two schools that you rank, and so on. Okay, and that gives you the likelihood of the probability of submitting a particular rank order list that has k schools ranked in it. And that's exactly what I'm saying here. Notice that the key thing is the denominator. The denominator there says, okay, only include a school in the denominator if this school is not a school that you ranked earlier. So if J is not RIK, where K is RIK prime, where K prime is lower than K, meaning that this is not a school that you ranked in a higher position already. That's what this is saying. Okay. Again, logic models, we know how to estimate this. If they have a closed form solution, that seems quite easy. Well, I mean, again, sorry. Okay, again, random coefficients, same thing, except that you have. Oh, it's the other one. That's it. Oh, that's right. Okay, thank you. If you have random coefficients, it's the same thing, except that you have to integrate over the random coefficient gamma. And again, as the question online said, you can think about, depending on how you want to parameterize this, if you think that different people may have different outside options, then gamma could be a random coefficient that hits every single inside option, essentially. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, so there are some papers that have used this approach. One is a paper by Attila Abdulkadiroglu, Dikil, Agarwal, and Parag Pathak, where they look at the New York City school, high school allocation system. And the other one is a Jaji and Sidibe that they look at high schools in Ghana. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Nichols and co-authors paper that is about New York City, just to give you an idea of the kind of things that people have done. So until 2003, students had to apply to 5 programs out of 600. And they have to apply it in a decentralized way. Many students were rejected. If you were rejected in school, you were placed on a wait list, sometimes they would never call. So it was, and then at the end of the day, you are without a school, so you go back to the school district and they put you in school. School data has empty seats. Now in 2003, they say, okay, now let's adopt a deferred acceptance. And one interesting question to ask is, okay, does this help students? Are students better off now that they can rank more schools and we have a centralized assignment? Okay. So what is the approach? Okay, now we're going to see the reports. Now they're going to say, okay, I see what each student reported to the mechanism. As opposed to a paper by Bucharest before, they only saw who went where. Okay, here they're going to see, okay, who applied where. Again, they're going to note, okay, this is DA, strategy proof. There's no gains from misrepresenting preferences. So they're going to estimate preferences, assuming truthful reports. And then they're going to simulate what, once you have the preferences, you can simulate what would happen under alternative allocation systems. One is a very simple neighborhood assignment. You get placed to a school that is in your neighborhood. That's it. No ability to choose whatsoever. Another one is an uncoordinated assignment that tries to simulate what was happening before 2003, where people only had to rank 3 and they didn't know what was going to happen, and also different acceptance. Okay, yes, so 2 questions, good. Yeah, sorry, I think you. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, before, without seeing the reports, you can still estimate preferences.
Yes.
Are you just estimating like a better demand system essentially?
Good. Good. Good question. So one thing that you can do, okay, it's a matter of quality of data in a way. You have more data, more information, so you can do more with less, with fewer students. But also you are able to identify, like, okay, do people that rank this school first also rank this other school first, second, or people that rank this other schools first tend to rank these other schools second? So in a way, by having second choices information, you can estimate richer demands. Okay, so it's more information that you can use to estimate richer demand systems.
I want to
yeah.
So the thing that Paulo mentioned about how you can do it with stability, and the previous one, that works if there's no lottery in the assignment system, and people have in the exam case where, you know, as a function of an exam, there's a cutoff, and you can construct these choice sets for every single student.
Right.
When you have a lottery, then there's some uncertainty when you're if you don't know the lottery when you're reporting your preferences, there's some uncertainty about whether you're going to get into the school that you rank first and second or not. And so you don't know your budget set. Your budget set is random in some sense. And so you can't technically use the previous method. And Paulo, I think later on you're going to talk about that case, right? So
right.
The Bukhari approach wouldn't work in here.
Right, because you don't see, you can't, that's what we were talking before. Basically, you were asking me, how do you construct the cutoffs if you don't see the lottery numbers, right? And that's the reason why you're saying that the approach in Bukhari wouldn't work here, because in your case you do see the lottery numbers, but if you didn't see them, then it wouldn't work. Yeah, exactly.
Even if we saw that, because students don't know the lottery number when they report, not exactly.
Yeah. Well, but if okay, we can talk. Yes. Okay. But still, you okay? So this is a. No, but you still have stability. But we can talk about that later. Yeah. We're going to discuss it and then give you one unified answer. Okay, so good. So that's what we're after, and they're going to essentially see. Okay, let's aggregate this computer aggregate welfare and figure out who wins and who loses under different. Okay, so this is the key thing that they find, and this is a very nice picture. I really like it. The key thing that you see is that, well, if you had neighborhood assignment, basically that's the worst you can do. Why? Because you don't allow people to express their preferences. You just put them in the neighborhood priority no matter what. Now, going from there to the uncoordinated mechanism, the one that you can run 5 and you figure out how it works, it improves quite a bit, actually. It gets you all 35% from the worst to the best. So it's not nothing. So some allowing people to express some preferences is beneficial. But the key thing, the thing that gives you the most is going from uncoordinated to coordinated. Okay, that gives you 45% of the improvement. Okay, and that is because now, if you don't get into one school, guess what? You can basically get to the next school, and if you don't get to that school, you can get to the next school, and so forth. Okay, so the mechanism itself is basically taking your full preference list into consideration, and you don't fall through the cracks, essentially. Okay, and then of course, then yeah, they have some improvement from going from the coordinate mechanism that we have to a student optimal stable mechanism, and then in this one you have to respect school priorities. Suppose that you say, screw these school's priorities, just let me maximize. Let me just find a Pareto efficient allocation from the perspective of the student. You're going to get a little bit more. But then, if you really go in and say, you know what, I'm going to do something even better, that is taking all the information that I know about intensity of preferences, you can do even better, because now you can put in intensity of preference and try to see where you're going to get. So that if there are two individuals that look the same, but one really likes one school and the other one doesn't, I'm not going to use my lottery number to break that tie. I'm going to look at how much they like a particular school and assign the one that likes the school better to that school. Then you can get 20% more. So this sets a little bit of, okay, what is really the money in here? Okay, a lot of the money is on organizing the allocation, and yeah, you can do a little bit more, but all of the money is from going from here to basically here. Questions? Yeah.
Do you think that this chart says something negative about the prospects for future research, where you can draw this for other like axes of interest and say, now that we have well understood canonical algorithms, we're kind of just in the last 20%. You know, we've realized most of the gains from like algorithmic thinking in school.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I'm sympathetic to that view. I think that that tells that, okay, let's try to look beyond this, but it also tells you that, look, this is how much. I mean, in this context, obviously, this is one particular context. We need to think about our context. Dan is going to talk about public housing tomorrow, and we're going to see. It's the fact that this is here, this happens here, doesn't mean that in other contexts should happen. So in a way, it says, look, this is one case. It supports your view, but you know, we need more evidence, I would say. Would you say something else? No? Okay, good. Okay, so there was another question. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, so here if students can only rank a handful of schools out of the 600, do we really think that they report preference?
Okay, we're going to talk about that next. So hold your questions. But yeah, you're right. And that's going to be something that is going to open the door for strategic reporting. And we're going to, and what I plan to do after we have lunch is to talk about those cases. Okay? Actually, given that I have some time, let me talk about that particular case. So to set up the discussion. So basically, because there's so much money here, many schools said, okay, yeah, let's, I mean, before even that, before the paper, many schools went ahead and centralized the allocation mechanism. But they typically weren't so concerned about the strategy proof requirement or desired or property of mechanisms. One way in which some strategic considerations got in the mechanism were because they couldn't rank all the possible schools. Another one is that they use mechanisms that are not strategy proof, like the Boston mechanism that Irene was talking about. Okay, so we have also developed tools to think about cases when the allocation mechanism is manipulable. You can't take the ordinal preferences that are reported to the mechanism at their face value. Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about why and how you have to strategize. But so let's talk about the case that you mentioned, the restricted list DA. Okay, so suppose that you can't rank all the schools, all the programs available. You can just rank, say, 16 or even 100, fewer than so you can't fully express your rank order list. So this is resolved by Herring and Klein 2009 that says that, look, the way that if this is the case, yeah, the mechanism happens to be manipulable. There are ways to strategize in this context, but you shouldn't mess up with your rank order list, meaning you shouldn't rank a school that you don't want, that you prefer less above a school that you prefer more. What you can do and what you should do is to skip some schools that basically, even if you like them, you think that are very low probability for you, that are kind of unattainable. So yeah, you like this school a lot, but really your chances of getting there are really low. Maybe you should skip that school to be able to rank another one that, yeah, you don't prefer as much, but it's very likely that you get, right? So this is okay. This is that okay. Well, there is some hope, meaning that people are not messing around with the rank order list. Shouldn't be messing around so much with the rank order list. But you need to be worried about this skipping behavior because it might be there. And the question, the other question is where, okay, an empirical question is where do people actually skip when they have restricted list DA? Okay. So this tells us immediately that we can do something. We can infer reveal preference arguments.
Okay, it's 50. Why did Catherine think it was 80? These guys are doctors. They've like got 8 years of education. They can do something useful, you know, and they get 50,000, right? I bet some of you have stipends that are more than that, right? In grad school. Not to say you're not doing anything useful, but it seems unfair, okay? And so the resident said, you know what? This is like, who thinks it's fair that they make 50? Who thinks it's unfair? Most people think that. More people think it's unfair. I think it's unfair. Anyhow, the residents got together and they're like, you know what? This is kind of crazy. I did undergrad. I did my MD, and you know, I get paid $50,000. The nurse practitioner and the PA gets paid much more. They get paid like 80, right? Why is that? Is it? And so they came up with the question. They said, you know, it's because you don't let us negotiate. Right? So they said that it's the match. We established that this match is somewhat unique, right? We established that hopefully that they get paid a little, they don't get paid as much as we think they should. And they said, okay, like these two things are sort of, correlation, causality, this is the reason. Okay, so they sued the medical residency program saying that the centralization is the reason why the salaries are 50 instead of 80. Okay, what other healthcare workers are getting. Okay, so getting to know the market and what are the unique things about that market, how it differs from other markets can help you think about questions. And it's an interesting question. Is it the case that this kind of centralization is going to depress salaries? So that's what we're going to try to. That's what I try to address at any rate. To be completely honest, the third year in me or the fourth year in me was like, okay, let's do the nerdy thing of trying to figure out preferences, not so much engaged into the question, the economic question. And then as I sort of matured, I was like, okay, this question is important. So let me also go after the question. Okay, so there's an evolution there. Yeah.
Maybe I'm not quite familiar with the institutional background, but could they adjust their hospitals in the future? Your wages determine when they initially match, that they can bargain in the later years.
No, so the salaries are set.
Also for the future.
Yeah, so it's just a function of how many years of experience you've got, but it's set. It's also not uncommon in, if you're a postdoc in the sciences, that's also how it works. Okay. All right. So the two questions that was addressed in the original version of the paper, one of them is how do government regulations affect, incentives to try to get more people training in rural areas? How would that, incentives versus quotas, how would that affect the final matches? So that's like a positive question. That comes up in, did you say Peru?
Colombia.
Colombia. Okay, so you'll see a paper on Peru, I believe, where this issue shows up, and there's an effect of maybe putting subsidies, loan forgiveness programs for getting residents to train there, so that there's more medical supply of labor there. So that's sort of one question that was addressed. A second question that was addressed was exactly this idea of why is it the case that Harry is right and Catherine isn't, so this antitrust lawsuit was about what is the role of the match and is it salary depression that is causing it. Spoiler alert, who here took the highest stipend offer to the PhD program that they went to? Okay, this was coincidental, I'm assuming, but you don't necessarily think about the stipend, right? I for one did not take the highest stipend offer, right? Because the PhD program was a investment in my future earnings and the training that is going to give me, right? Similarly, residents care about the training that they're going to get, and they care much more about that than the salary necessarily. And so there's going to be some limitation to how much salary bargaining is going to get salaries up to the levels that Catherine was mentioning. Okay, so the data is going to be on stable matches, final stable matches. So I got this data not from the NRMP. I got this data from the American Medical Association, where the poor grad student card did work. They have a census of all residents and of all residency programs and say, okay, who are the residents that are working that are at your program? Tell me about their medical school and their background, etc. So you have data set on which residency programs are out there, the residents that work there, but you don't know the whole underlying matching process. Okay, and it's pairwise stability, which you guys know. I'm going to assume it's stable. And the first thing that you might ask is stability a good assumption, and why might it not be a good assumption? Okay, so there are a couple of things here. There's an interview process, and the interview process might result in violations of stability, right? Maybe the right person is not interviewed. Any other reasons why stability might not be exactly right? Yeah, go ahead.
There could be some two-body problems.
There could be some two-body problems, yeah. So maybe the notion of stability that we're going to use is not quite right. Do any of your medical students ask you how to game the match? your friends, yeah, they think that they can game the match. There's some signaling potentially, right? So there are some reasons why stability may not be exactly right, but I'm going to pretend and that stability is okay. This is Harry said that researchers are good at pretending, but you will see also that it's going to be the characteristics of residency programs and the residents that we're going to use. So it won't matter so much whether Alice or Bob match with MGH, Mass General Hospital, but like the characteristics of the people that matter. Okay, so we have data from 8 years from the American Medical Association. The multiple years are going to be used primarily for precision. I'm not thinking of this as panel data with large T. It's more like large N data. And I see the residents' birth location, which medical schools they went to, etc. And you have a relatively extensive set of characteristics for hospitals. In 2010 dollars back then, the average salary was $46,000, and there was some limited dispersion around it. Okay, residence preferences are going to be based on the Berry and Pecos pure characteristics model. So UIJT will be some characteristics, observed characteristics, ZIJT times beta I, plus delta times the salary, the wage, WJT, plus XCJT. Okay. In the paper, we will allow XCJT to be correlated with W. So there'll be an endogeneity problem, and we'll solve that using a control function approach and an instrument. In the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss that. Okay. And so there's some program characteristics that I worked on merging together to make this happen. Okay. The preferences of the programs of the residents are going to be limited, primarily because the data set has very limited characteristics of the residents. So there's going to be a vertical model, a homogeneous model where there's a human capital index H sub I, and every program agrees that this is the best resident, etc. Okay, and so that's going to be xi times alpha plus epsilon I. Epsilon I is going to be normally distributed. And I got this idea from talking to the chair of the residency program in Brigham Women's Hospital, because he's like, there's a pecking order, more or less, that the best residents tend to get offers at the tend to have the best programs ish where they can match. We look at the X's of those residents. We won't look at the specific resident. Okay, and so that's sort of the idea. And it gives you a unique stable match, easy way to simulate it. The highest human capital resident goes first. They pick whichever program they want, so on and so forth. Okay, so quite heterogeneous on one side, limited heterogeneity, no heterogeneity on the other side. Okay, to make some progress. And so a salary endogeneity is going to be based on a control function approach. And there's going to be this idea of exclusion restrictions on each side that are going to tell me something about heterogeneity. So one thing that is allowed for is that residents might have preferences for the location of the program that they're going to train at. So maybe people who are who train in a particular area will have preferences for a program in that area. Okay, and maybe where they were born, they have preferences for where they were born, programs in the area they were born. And if you are a rural born resident, whether you match with the rural program or not. Okay, and so that's going to be identified, or the loose argument that I gave, which has been now formalized, is that basically there's an exclusion restriction that programs don't care about this. Okay, they don't care where the resident comes from. It's just that this is what the program cares about. That's what the resident cares about. So whenever I see relative to the central tendency more matches based on where you were training or where you were born, I'm going to attribute it to the residence preferences for the programs. Okay, all of that sorting is going to be loading on that. Okay. So we're going to do a minimum distance type of estimation procedure. So there's a match that I observe in the data. Let's call it mu. And there are going to be some moments I can construct from the data as well as from a simulated match. So there'll be xi, which are the resident characteristics. Sorry, I switched the notation a bit. I apologize. There'll be the resident characteristics and the program characteristics. You take the essentially the second moment of that joint distribution. Xi times Zi. I see that in the data, my model is going to predict something about that. Then there's this within program variance of resident characteristics. Remember, I showed you those Monte Carlo plots, right? And so this is capturing exactly that. So take a resident in a program, take resident I, whose characteristics Xi, take the average characteristics of all residents in the program, square it, and then look at whether there's a dispersion in that or not. Okay. If there's dispersion in that, there must be something else that's not captured by X that the programs care about. Okay. And there's going to be a second moment in that based on the kinds of peers. Okay, cross moment. So simulate minimum distance. I need to figure out how to simulate the match. That's pretty easy. I take a parameter alpha, take parameters delta, something that governs the distribution of beta, and I go to Whitney's toolbox. I draw the unobservables, okay, and I simulate the pairwise stable match, having the top resident pick the program that they want, subtract the quantity, number of seats of that program, program by 1, move on to the second resident, and so on, and I simulate a match. Okay. Yeah.
I guess you kind of gave the anecdote about the variance, but I was wondering, like, the variance-based moments, but I was wondering if there were other moments you maybe considered, or like how you kind of really decided to pick those.
Yeah, so I made decisions based on relatively limited knowledge at that time, where I did not have the kinds of proofs that we now have. How would I have done this differently? I think I might have gone to a likelihood-based approach. I think that's not infeasible anymore. Like a Gibbs sampler type of likelihood-based Bayesian approach, which has Gibbs sampling, etc. in it, and that's what Paulo uses. And the beauty of likelihood-based approach, as Whitney mentioned, is that it captures all of the information in the data, and any sort of function of that is going to be. Okay, so you simulate it. You can compute the pairwise stable match. You do that many times. Fix your simulation draws. Very important. Can't tell you how many nights I lost because of that. And then you get the moments as a function of the simulated moments as a function of theta. Okay. And then you minimize the distance. You say, okay, m hat minus the simulated m hat of theta, compute the sandwich form, and you minimize. Okay. Any questions about how to do this?
Could you tell what the theorem-based moment is?
Yeah, it's saying, look at x1, look at the average of the x2s of another dimension of the x's of the peers, and then you match them. What is it really doing? So here I've got the variance, and this is like the covariance between x1 and x2. Did I make the best decision? No. But it seemed like based on the Monte Carlos that I did, that's what was guiding most of my work back then. In addition to that double vertical model, this seemed like it was getting me pretty good answers. All right. Now, I hope one thing that's coming through is that the paper's not perfect, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? So you should still go ahead and make progress and think about what you've contributed, not what's sort of deficient necessarily. You should be aware of what's deficient, but not necessarily always let that stop you, as long as the contribution is substantial. That is an opinion, not necessarily something that everybody agrees with. Okay. Okay, so that's how you estimated that's how the model was estimated. Let me tell you a little bit about the preference estimates of the residents for the programs. Here are various characteristics of the programs, and it tells you a salary equivalent term for that. Okay, and I want to sort of say, okay, if I compare a program that has a 1 standard deviation higher or lower case mix index, what is the average willingness to pay to train at those programs as opposed to other programs? That's sort of how you want to interpret those coefficients. Not if you took a program and you changed its case mix index. That's not the intention here. It's about the average willingness to pay of those types of programs. So the case mix index has a willingness to pay of about $5,000. So residents are willing to take a salary cut in order to train at programs with a higher case mix index. Case mix index is a measure of the complexity of the cases that you see. And that makes sense. You are there to learn. And so you are potentially willing to take a salary cut in order to go to a program with a better, more complicated case mix index. My medical resident friends always want to go to the programs that have lots of patients with gunshot wounds in the inner cities, right? Like, because that's where you learn the most. Okay, so that's what that is. NIH funding, like, the big medical centers that are academic, that's where the medical residents want to go to. They wouldn't take a salary cut in order to go there, larger hospitals, etc. Okay. And then there's some preferences for going to the same medical school state as where you trained and what state is where you trained. Okay. And so these are going to be reasons why residents are willing to take a salary cut in order to go to a program that they want to go to. And so there's a large willingness to pay for going to a higher quality program. Okay, so now let's imagine for a second that we took the match and we removed it, and then we had a market where you could negotiate salaries. What would that negotiation look like when you had multiple offers? Anyone? Should I cold call? I do have your names in front of me. So somebody who hasn't spoken up so far, perhaps.
The question?
I should repeat the question. So imagine you're a medical resident, okay? And there's no match. You have multiple salary offers. And you're like, okay, let's try to negotiate. I'm the program director. Let's simulate that interaction. What would that look like? What would you come to me and say? Let's say you have a salary at program A that is, $40,000. My salary is $30,000, but I'm MGH. I'm Mass General Hospital. Somebody who hasn't spoken before, or at least in my class. How would that go? Carl. Sorry.
So I guess I would start by telling you my salary if I have to tell the truth.
You have to show me the offer.
I have to show you the offer.
Yeah.
And then I show you the offer.
And what would I say?
You'd probably say I'm MGH. You just want to come here and
Exactly. I would say I'm MGH. So yeah, you can take your $40,000. Okay, so that's what would happen. And what would that mean? That this negotiation wasn't very effective, right? And you're not going to get paid the marginal product of your labor, which is what there were some economists, famous economists, who wrote a brief in favor of the plaintiffs, of the resident plaintiffs. And they sort of said that, okay, without the match, you'd get the competitive wage, which is the marginal part of labor. And Kurt just explained why you wouldn't get the marginal part of labor. Okay, there's a large distribution of willingness to pay. To get to a better program, you're willing to take a salary cut. Okay, so maybe you're a hotshot resident, and that's why MGH wants you, and you're very valuable. But yet, MGH doesn't need to pay you much in order to attract you. It only has to pay as much as what your next best offer is, right? Which may be at a good place too, Brigham Women's. But Brigham Women's Hospital also doesn't pay a lot because they also have a limited number of positions, right? So there's scarcity of residency positions. And because there's scarcity of residency positions, there's going to be a salary markup. It's regulated. Okay. So why did I go through this exercise? I went through this exercise because when you think about a counterfactual, you want to simulate it in your head too. You want to say, if this was the world and it looked different from what the world looks like, what would happen? How would the people interact with each other, right? What would the change in the rules mean about the interactions? How does it differ from the current interactions? And that will help you illustrate, at least to yourself, the economics behind the rule. The economics behind the rule that you cannot negotiate is to, okay, now let's allow a negotiation. Let's think about what the equilibrium will look like. What would that interaction look like? Imagine yourself as an agent in that new market with the new market design. Okay, and what does that mean? Okay, so here's some sort of formalization behind what happened, the history of it. So a group of residents in 2002 alleged a price fixing conspiracy in which they said that the NRMP matching program has the purpose and effect of depressing, standardizing, and stabilizing compensation below competitive levels. And the reason that's inflexible salaries and a restraint to competition, the inability of courts to negotiate with me, that is resulting in this. Okay, and so they used a perfect competition benchmark as an alternative, and Orly Ashenfelter's brief said that it's exactly Catherine's $80,000 based on salaries paid to nurse practitioners and physician assistants that would have been the counterfactual match. And so each resident faces a damage of about $30,000 because of this conspiracy. Okay, the lawsuit was dismissed because Congress enacted an exception to antitrust law for the medical match. Okay, so it went through the first round, and there was a law in Congress in the Pension Equity Act as a line, and said that there's no that for the purposes of antitrust law, the medical match is excluded. Participation in the medical match is excluded. So let's think about the counterfactual. It's a competitive equilibrium in which there's going to be an assignment of residents to programs, and resident programs with fixed salaries that clear the market. So that so now there's going to be essentially negotiation. And so there's going to be no case in which court wants to go to any potential offer from any other program at the going wages that are program resident specific. Okay, so now the equilibrium concept allows for flexible salaries in addition to matching. And then it's it's a core allocation that corresponds to the Shapley-Schubeck assignment problem. So it's not just enough to simulate it in your head. You need to know some economic theory to try and map it to a particular equilibrium concept. That's how theory also plays a role. And so it has these two properties. The allocation is individually rational, and no resident program pair would prefer recontracting with each other at potentially negotiated salaries. And so that's sort of the equilibrium concept now. Okay, so why would there be a markdown in salaries here? Buell-Levin had a paper that showed that without flexible salaries, the match can depress salaries. And this paper is going to give you a different reason, which has got to do with the capacity constraints. Okay, so this is going to say it may not be the match, it could be the capacity constraint. So imagine every program can match to one resident. And there are n residents and programs. The quality of the program is QJ. The utility of the resident for the program is A times QJ plus the wage. So residents like the wage. And then the resident program pair produces some output F of QH, H comma Q, that is net of training costs. Okay, so let's get rid of the Beckerian reasons for salaries being below the value of the job because there's some training. Okay, so let's think of H as net of training costs. In the Beckerian model, the training costs are paid by the workers, right? So let F be the thing that would be not net of that, and let F be supermodular so that higher quality resident to the higher quality program produces more output for the program. And the residents and the program's profit is F of HQ times minus W. But each program can only hire one resident. Now, what happens is that because of this A of Q term, you're not going to get salaries equal to F. So we can, in fact, bound the salaries without knowing F. Let F be the output net of costs, and let A of Q be the implicit tuition, which is how much is the value of training. And you can show that in any competitive equilibrium, salaries are going to be marked down by this much. So the markdown at MGH is going to be the highest relative to the output. And markdown at the lower quality programs is going to be close to 0. Okay, so that also results in compression. Okay, and so it results precisely because residents are willing to pay for training at higher quality programs. Just like, you know, you don't want to go to necessarily the PhD program that pays you the highest stipend. You want to think about the future, right, for yourself. And so it's kind of like a compensating differential. It's not exactly a compensating differential because it's not that the utility at every program is different. It's a lower bound for the salary depression in a general class of models. In fact, the bound is achieved when F only depends on H. Okay, so you can take these estimates and then you can quantify that implicit tuition by solving for the lowest markdown that is sustained in any equilibrium. That's, you know, you can look at the paper if you're interested in that. That's not the point of the exercise here. It's just to show you that the estimated implicit tuition, depending on the range of estimates, is between 23,000 and 43,000. So between half to all of the gap between Harry and Catherine's estimates is explained by this thing called implicit tuition, right? And if you think about it, it makes intuitive sense that, you know, during your training years, you're paying some implicit tuition if training is scarce, if high quality training is scarce. Okay.
It's not just that, it has to be general.
Has to be
General.
It cannot be firm specific. It can't be that my training is only useful for MGH, and by design these programs are such that, you know, you graduate from MGH and then you work somewhere else, right? You like finish your residency program and you work somewhere else. Yeah. Okay, any questions about that example?
Go back to the writing and patterns. You set up like pure characteristics without I to shop. Is that how come?
Great question. So your name is? Tension. Yeah, great question. So pull a fast one on you, right? So there's no epsilon ijt. What's with that, right? Okay. So normally we would have an epsilon ijt that's logit. Okay, you could do that in this model in principle. Okay, that wouldn't be identified, or at least to my best understanding. Maybe now it would. Yeah, maybe now it would be. At the time, I thought that it wouldn't be identified separately from XC, the distribution of XC. Okay, but why do we put the epsilon in the consumer choice model in the first place? Okay, I actually don't think that the independence assumption in the standard consumer choice model is a very good assumption, because what that means is there's implicitly a lot of unobserved characteristics of the products and a lot of unobserved preferences. There are lots of products. There's got to be a lot of unobserved characteristics of the product and lots of idiosyncratic reasons why people like those characteristics. If you want to think about this in characteristic space that people like, and that results in this independent shock that's consumer independent and product independent, right? So I think that sort of a micro foundation that's based on a characteristics model has some appeal to it. So this model captures that. In the consumer choice case, it would be very difficult to have this model explain the data, because there'd be these cases of dominated choices. Like, you know, if there'd be some cases where, you know, that you wouldn't have, you wouldn't be able to explain the market shares. It could be that for whatever parameters you look in this model, you know, there'd be some choices that are worse than for every consumer as opposed to some other choice. And so once you have this epsilon shock, that problem goes away. Okay. Now in the matching market case, the dominated choice can exist, because, you know, there's only limited capacity at the best programs, at a better program, right? They can only take about 8 to 10 residents or 20 residents, whatever that is. And so that same problem doesn't show up, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that the simplification of this model is strictly better, because, you know, there's one unobservable exceed, right? You might want to have a factor structure with lots of unobservable characteristics and lots of unobserved factor loadings that are that are consumer specific on these loadings. That might be a better model. So, you know, there are two polar things. One is the epsilon IJT IID shock. One is this one. World is probably somewhere in the middle, is my guess. Anybody has other views on that? That's totally fine. Okay, so that's the sort of story about the paper. Some sort of background of the institutional process. I hope I gave you a little bit sense of the market design, empirical market design process. You sort of engage with the market, think about it. You try to like figure out how to use the data. You use the equilibrium assumption, think about which rules matter, which rules don't matter, and use that to craft a research paper around it. I would be amiss if I did not talk a little bit about the TU models. So let me spend a little bit of time on those models. You know, they have some appeal to them. So the transfer utility model, one of the classical models, is the Chu and CR model from 2006, where the two sides again, I and j, index by I and j, one-to-one matching, and what you've got is you know, the value of I from value of agent I, who's of type X, matching with an agent of type Y, the discrete types X and Y, is alpha of X, alpha sub XY minus some transfer that is XY specific. Okay. Plus epsilon I times epsilon of I sub xy. So each individual I has some preferences for each type of the other side. Okay. They don't have preferences for specific agents on the other side. There's no epsilon ij. It's epsilon I y, really. Okay, conditional on x. And similarly, there's u sub j of xy. So there's the gamma of xy plus the transfer. It goes from one person to the other, so there's no loss, right? And then there's the epsilon sub j xy. Okay. Now, conditional on the transfer vectors, you can come up with the demand function and the supply function. You know, you would try to, if you wanted to couch it in terms of demand and supply. So at the transfers tau of xy, what are the proportion of agents of type xy of side I that want to be matched to type y? Type x that want to be matched to type y. Okay. This minus the share that want to be matched to the outside option, that log share difference is given by, because it's logit, it gives you this alpha of xy minus the alpha of the outside option minus the transfer. The supply is people of type y wanting to match with people of type x. Okay. And those shares are given by this. Let's say that there's equal share mass one on each side. Okay. And so in equilibrium, demand has to equal supply. That's going to determine tau. All right. And you get that this closed form, there's a closed form for the alpha of xy relative to the alpha of the outside option for type x, and gamma of xy relative to the outside option for type y. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just equate these two mu's, okay, and solve. And it's given by this expression. All right, I'm sure that if you spend 3 minutes tonight, if you're so inclined, you'd be able to arrive at this, okay, by setting equality. And you can see that some of the transfers is identified. Okay, again, not the individual components, it's only the sum that's identified. Another thing that's identified is alpha minus tau. You can see that directly from these two equations, and gamma minus tau. Okay, and so this is for the logit case, and then Galachon and Salanier extend this to other functional forms. And the trick they use, if you're interested in another link, is exactly the same trick that John mentioned yesterday in this paper of Rockefeller meets McFadden with convex duality. And so that allows them to generalize it to other functional forms. Okay, so there's like these kinds of things come up quite often, even in these models. And then there's an extension for the imperfectly transferable utility model by Galachon, Commoners, and Weber, where you can transfer some utility, but there's some portion that gets lost in the transfer. Maybe there's a leaky bucket, and that leaky bucket results in some loss during that transfer. Okay. And so if you're interested in a world where that looks like more like this, then you could use this. Then there's another class of approaches that is based on work by Fox and some co-authors of his as well, that had an early semi-parametric approach that had some initial issues but has been fleshed out a lot more now. Okay, so I will mention it. So imagine that there's an upstream downstream firm pair J and I that receive payoffs. Pay pi of ij for the downstream firm minus some transfer between the firms, and pi of ij u plus tau ij. So there's some total surplus fij. Now, in the transferable utility case, you know that overall efficiencies, overall welfare is maximized by a stable match. Okay, and so if I took the observed matching mu, and I constructed a counterfactual, swapped people by switching J and I would get a lower match. Okay, so for any other alternative mu prime, I would get a lower total surplus. Okay. For F. Okay, and so in particular, if you swap I and I prime's partners, then everything else cancels out. Okay, kind of like how Bob talked about finite dependence. Similarly, like everything else cancels out. Okay, and so the swap motivates an inequality that Fij if I and J are matched plus Fi prime J prime if I prime and J prime are matched has to be higher than flipping the matches of I and J. Okay. So that's true if F is the true underlying primitive payoffs. Okay, and Fox goes from there to motivate a maximum score estimator that's akin to Mansky 75 that says, let me take some characteristics xij that I observe multiplied by theta. So that's a parametric form for this, and let's make that happen. Let's look at those same inequalities and maximize the objective function, the maximum score objective function, by saying, let me find the least number of deviations of that inequality. Okay, so that initially we didn't know necessarily what is the distribution of primitives, and that would justify a maximum score estimator. And there is a paper by Fox et al. In 2018 that shows a general class of unobservables under which in the additively separable unobservables case, where you can take the inequalities and make that work and minimize it, and you get an estimate of theta. The estimate of theta tells you gives you an estimate of the total surplus coming from the observed component of the matches. So it can tell you that this is how much matches between two different xij's matter from the observed site. Okay, so that was very brief on the transferable utility models. But if you're interested, here are some references. The survey article that I mentioned earlier that Paulo co-authored with me, I think that, yeah, that one's in the Dropbox, and it has a number of other references if you're interested in this literature area. Okay, So I'll pause for any questions if you have any about sort of either the papers, the general sort of market design approach that I sort of mentioned, or anything else. Yes.
I'm using this paper by Hitch, Pascu, and Ravelli on matching and dating in online markets. And so, you know, they look at the matches and estimate a model with preferences from kind of decentralized matching and bargaining. And they suggest that, you know, when there's slow search frictions, that dynamic process leads to something that's equivalent to a stable allocation from the deferred acceptance algorithm.
Yeah, so let me recap that paper for the audience. So they had, I don't remember all the details, but you know, roughly they had data for some matching dating platform where you could swipe right. That back then it wasn't that, it was something slightly different. You could, like, you know, contact somebody, and based on who you swiped on or you did not, they estimated the preferences by saying that people who you contacted, you must have preferred to people who you didn't contact. And then they took those preferences, simulated the algorithm, so simulated the deferred acceptance algorithm on both sides to say, okay, what would be the matches? And in some cases, the other person also swiped right? And so you saw, let's call those sort of the matches, right? Then let's look at the types of people on characteristics that would be matched by deferred acceptance and then what the data looks like. That's what they did. And they saw that it was kind of similar, right? So that's sort of saying that even though that market does not use one interpretation of this, a favorable interpretation for this work, is that even though that market does not use a stable matching algorithm in which people submit preferences and all that stuff, the sorting patterns of who gets to date whom look similar to what's produced by the deferred acceptance algorithm. That's sort of that's what you're saying. And yeah, this is the sort of type of juice that this literature is extracting. Like what types of people are matched with what type of
Is it like somehow analogous to the revenue equivalence theorem? You have different mechanisms, but they're resulting, you know, in similar allocations, right?
So I wouldn't go that far because Paulo showed you something which not like that, right? Because you have the Cambridge mechanism and the deferred acceptance mechanism that don't look similar. There are some theory papers that show that there are certain classes of mechanisms that require some properties like Pareto efficiency, etc. And in a large market, they produce asymptotically equivalent matches. So Marek Picia has a number of papers in that vein. It's you know, even the revenue equivalence theorem has some conditions, like, you know, it has to be efficient matching, right? And is one of the requirements in the revenue equivalence theorem. So there's some requirements like that, but yeah.
Yeah, there's one other paper I want to ask you about. There's a paper by Chao Fu called Equilibrium Applications, Admissions, and acceptances, right? So she models the whole process, you know, in the JP in 2014. So it's modeling the college market, US, which is, you know, a dynamic mechanism. But then the question is could you take her preferences and then try to say, suppose we ran it through a deferred acceptance algorithm, what would there be a more efficient outcome, right?
Yeah, you could do that counterfactual. I don't think the paper did it, but if I remember.
Has anyone ever done that or tried to look at
so the paper that Paulo mentioned of mine is, there aren't that many papers that look at compare decentralized and centralized markets. And part of the reason is that getting a handle on a decentralized market can sometimes be quite hard because especially if you want to model the frictions well, and Chao's paper is one of the exceptions where they've been able to do that, because you have to like get a sense of exactly what the process is. You have to model those frictions, and then you have to say, okay, I get this data from a decentralized system, model all of those frictions, estimate preferences, and then compare to a counterfactual. So when you don't observe enough about the market, it can be hard to model the frictions appropriately because you have this identification issue. You can see these models are already somewhat under-identified. And so now try to model the frictions on top of that, it becomes kind of hard. And so so that's sort of the barrier. But yeah, typically if you have good insight into how that works, and actually you'll see in the conference a paper where they look at interview frictions and they try to model what the interview frictions imply about the efficiency of the matching.
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. So let's all head out to the steps of the economics department. You should follow us and we'll take a picture. And tomorrow, 9 o'clock.